Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our first IDSS Distinguished Seminar Series of the fall semester. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Rachel Kranton from Duke University. Professor Kranton studies how institutions and the social setting affect economic outcomes. And in fact, she's one of the first or earliest economists to bring in network theory into economic thinking and to emphasize the role of identity in economics. I personally, having worked in network theory, got interested in network economics through reading one of her papers many years ago. And Rachel holds a PhD in economics from University of California at Berkeley. She has had fellowships at Russell Sage Foundation in New York and Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She's a fellow of the Econometric Society, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she now serves as the Dean of Social Sciences at Duke University. Rachel, thank you so much for coming virtually. We'd hope to host you in person, but for now, this will do, and we look forward to your presentation.
Right. Well, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so very much. It's always wonderful to visit MIT, rather virtually or in person. So thanks for the opportunity. And this is ongoing work. So of course, David McAdams, who is my co-author, we very much welcome your comments. So we are building a basic model of the market for news in the context of social networks. So of course, this is a big topic, but let me tell you our particular objective. Okay, I thought I would advance my screen. Oh, it did work. Okay, so let me give you the introduction. Okay, so we all know that there's a very large public and academic interest in false news or fake news, and we can debate what the difference is between false news and fake news. So we're going to take the understanding that there's a piece of news out there that isn't true. That's what we're calling false news. Now, false news is not necessarily new. Okay, there's been organizations throughout history that have sponsored news to support an end and have exaggerated facts and so on. And so one just example that perhaps turned out all right is that the British intelligence was introducing exaggerated news for release in US movie theaters in order to encourage the United States participation in World War II. So this is just to say that this idea isn't particularly new. What is the contemporary media environment, which is new, that makes us want to question how false news is produced and spreads? Okay, and again, I don't know why for some reason, I've got to figure out which I've got to push here. So first of all, there's many, many providers of news. So unlike the World War II example, it's very, very easy to enter the market for news. So there's the brick and mortar providers, there's bloggers, troll factories, the famous basement dwellers, etc. Consumers are organized quite differently. Consumers, as we all know, are very connected and interconnected through social media. So news has a potentially very large reach. Consumers may also be possibly more sophisticated than the typical cinema goer in 1940. More or less, and we'll talk about the more or less. So that's the contemporary media environment. And what we're going to do within this contemporary media environment is build a very simple model of news demand within a social network. One thing that might be different from the other models out there about news and news bias is our consumers are going to be completely rational. Our consumers just want the truth. Okay, consumers can possibly fact check and then act on the news. So they look at a news item and say, do I believe this? Do I not? And if they think it's true, they can pass it on to a friend in the social network. Well, I see what happens. Somehow the Zoom pops up and then there we go. So the network essentially serves as both a filter and a spread of the news. So a piece of news, in order to reach other people, has to go through other people who filter it and decide whether to spread it or not. Now, in a world like this, if the news veracity, the truthfulness, the average truthfulness of news were fixed, then more links would increase consumer welfare, right? It would be the links would then, the people would only spread a piece of news which they thought was sufficiently likely to be true, and consumers would benefit from having somebody else tell them, oh, I think this is a piece of true news. That's if the news veracity is fixed. But, and here's the important innovation, news veracity is not fixed. It is endogenous. There are producers of news. And these producers of news, as I mentioned before, there's many now producers of news, and they may be producing pieces of news which are more or less true. So what we do is we have now a simple model of news supply where we have profit maximizing producers that are maximizing profits by producing news that's being sent out through the social network. And there's cost to publish high quality true news. We're going to distinguish between producers that have different revenue sources. There are some producers, and we'll focus on that case as our base case, where their revenue comes from consumers viewing their news. And I'll show you some examples as we, to fix ideas in a little bit. We're also going to consider producers of news whose objective or whose revenue source is how consumers act upon their news. And these may be more partisan news producers. And so the key innovation of this paper is to endogenize the product that diffuses through a network. We all know there's lots and lots of papers out there where there's something that diffuses through the network. We also know that there's third parties that maybe target a part of the network. They produce a product and they want to target to do some influencers, and those influencers then, will tell other people about that product, and it will diffuse through a network in that way. What's different about this paper is that the product itself depends on the diffusion process. Okay, so that we feel is perhaps an independent contribution, not just the particular setting. Though, of course, if you know of papers that are close to this in this particular point, I'd love to hear. We'd love to hear from you. So to fix ideas, let's give some examples of what we're trying to capture. So let's take a traditional news outlet that has moved online. So like the New York Times. So here's a New York Times article. The New York Times article is accompanied by, it's printed or it's broadcast online. People are going to see this news article and they can possibly share it with their friends. So every news article has those little things. You can email it, forward it, tweet it, whatever you want to do. The consumer may take action based on this news. So a consumer sees this article and decides whether or not to vote in a particular way. What does the New York Times get? The New York Times gets revenues largely from advertising. So there's on all of these, you read the online media, there's advertising everywhere. Now, it could be the New York Times is also interested in the outcomes from the voting, but that's the difference in the revenue stream. So there is revenues largely from advertising from these sort of brick and mortar outlets. Now, there is explicitly out there fake news sites. So this is a very famous Denver Guardian news site. It's fictitious. And in other words, it's not actually a news site. It's just somebody has a website that they publish news. And what are they getting out of it? They are again getting revenue advertising, advertising from revenue. So this is the sole purpose of this particular quote unquote news site, is to get revenue from advertising. There are, of course, news sites with explicit political agendas. So this is Breitbart, right? Where consumers, again, may view the news, decide to share it with their friends and neighbors. Again, it has all of those pieces there, but how you could forward this piece of news to somebody. And there's advertising revenue, which, of course, accompanies these news items as well. Now, there's also government-sponsored news outlets. So this is these troll factories, let's call them. And these troll factories, we might think about, are being sponsored by governments, and their revenues or the returns are the actions based on the news. So here's an example of a Heart of Texas. This was a particular Facebook, it's a fake group, but it was a Russian-sponsored group that had a Facebook page, and it actually sponsored a rally, and then there was a counter rally. This is just one example. So these are the different actors that we have in our supply side. right? And they run we see the supply side runs the gamut here. And so we're going to try and, do what we do in this world is to try and build a baseline model where we define exactly the motives of a particular kind of producers. And then I'm going to add some of these other kinds of producers and think about how the different motives of, or changing the motives of producers changes our outcomes. So let me give you an overview of the model, of the market model. Can you see my cursor when I do this? Does that, okay, great. Okay, at t equals 0, the first thing that happens is reporters, they are going to receive a cost draw, a story. They receive a story idea or a lead, and they decide whether or not to spend a particular cost in order to produce high or low quality news. And we're going to say that high quality news is more likely to be true and low quality news is more likely to be false. So this is true or false news, and then they broadcast it. This choice here determines a news veracity. So this is the average truthfulness of the news. Okay. Consumers will see a piece of news. They don't know whether the news is true or false. But of course, in Equilibrium, oh gosh, let me go back. They will know P0. Consumers then will receive a private signal. So they read an article in the New York Times and say, I don't know, should I believe this or not? Sounds somewhat plausible. And depending on their signal that they get, they decide whether or not to share the piece of news. That then leads to news visibility. So all of the people that I've shared this piece of news with will see these shared stories. This will lead to the number of views, and the number of views for a true story will be different than the number of views for a false story, which leads to producers' revenues from the views. And so their producers' incentives to produce true or false news will depend on the differential in the number of views of true news versus false news. So this is a revenue from views market model. And of course, what we'll be looking for here is the equilibrium veracity. Okay. Now, if there's revenue from actions, the model works very similarly except in time t equals 2. Consumers are going to look at a piece of news, get a private signal as to whether the news is correct or not. So they do a gut check, or they do a little Googling, whatever it is to sort of see, should I pass this piece of news on to my friends? And then the consumers see how many of their friends have passed on to them a particular piece of news. And consumers will make an inference based on the number of friends who have shared a piece of news and decide, should I now think this news is true or false? And then how should I vote, say? And so this action here is the actions that are taken when expected actions from having broadcast a true piece of news and the expected actions of a false piece of news. That gives the producers revenue. And of course, the differential is what gives the producers the incentive to produce true or false news. So that's an overview of the model. Of course, I will go into the details as we move along, but let me give you a sense of some of the results we get. So as I said, our objective is to look for the equilibrium news veracity. So one of the first observations is that some false news must circulate in any equilibrium where true news is produced. That's what we mean by functional equilibrium. And of course, this has to be true, because if all news were always true, then consumers would always pass on to their neighbors any piece of news, in which case producers have no incentive to produce true news because it's going to get passed on anyway. So we need some false news in order to have any equilibrium where true news is produced. Let's take a look at the outcomes when producers' revenues are coming from consumers' views of the news. So that you want to think about this as advertising revenue that accompanies a news item. The first result is that there's a non-monotonicity in network density. So network density here is the number of neighbors that any individual has. So first, think about a network where there's very low density. So I only have, say, one neighbor. And now we're going to increase that. Now I have two neighbors. Okay, how does that affect producers' incentives? Well, producers are going to earn more on the margin by producing a true piece of news than a false piece of news, because the true piece of news is likely to get through my filter and go on to two neighbors rather than one. Okay, so that seems good. More density, more true news is produced. But now when density gets very high and we increase links, we actually go the other way. So now I think I have 1,000 neighbors, right? I have 1,000 neighbors and now I have 1,001 neighbors, okay? That's not going to affect how much true news spreads, right? On the margin, it's going to affect more false news. False news now it's very now much easier for false news to get to another person. So on the margin, false news actually becomes more profitable in very, very dense networks where we increase links. So in very high dense networks, even false news can spread very widely, which can lead to more false news being produced. And then we have a result that in infinitely dense networks, to be, of course, described formally, the equilibrium involves only false news, and there is no true news produced. Okay, so another exercise that we do, like I said, is I want to bring in different kinds of news producers. So a different exercises, we say, okay, I've got a bunch of news producers out there who are interested in, say, advertising revenue. And I'm going to add some what we call misinformation agents. So these are our Heart of Texas websites, right? These are agents that enter the news market, and the only thing they do is produce false news. Okay. What we show is that this introduction of misinformation agents can actually lead to greater incentives for the bona fide producers to produce true news, because consumers become more judicious about sharing news. So just introducing misinformation doesn't destroy the news market, okay, if it's not too much of it, because you will actually get a response from bona fide news producers. They will produce more true news. And the third thing I'd like to tell you about is that now consider a scenario where producers' revenues are not from just the advertising revenue that accompanies their news items. Producers, say, have partisan objectives, and their revenues or the returns from producing a piece of news are from the consumer's actions. And here we get an opposite result than from the advertising model when networks are very dense. When networks are extremely dense, then consumers can infer the truth very well, whether a piece of news is true or false, from their neighbors' sharing behavior. And essentially, the network becomes very good at generating information about the truth of the news. And since what producers care about is that consumers believe the news, not just that they see the news, because that's the difference. You will get more true news produced when producers care about consumers' actions in highly dense networks. Okay, so that's a summary of the results. How are we doing on time? So let me see if I can get into the guts of the modeling here. A real quick run through the literature. Of course, there's papers out there on news and biased news and studies of fake news. This paper is also related to the work on social learning in networks and on cascades. Particular papers out there where it was more precisely related are the work on opinion formation networks and the work on third parties that target networks. And again, relative to this literature, one of the innovations of this paper is to endogenize the actual product that diffuses in the networks. Okay, so if there's no questions, I'll start with the model. Okay, I'll just go. All right, there's a very, yes.
Sorry, can you explain the incentive of the individuals who forward the news?
Yes, that's going to come up. The individuals who forward the news get utility or some benefit from sharing a true piece of news. That's what we're going to assume. So that could come from, it's a reduced form model of some kind of either a reputation, I'm somebody you should believe. So it's a social motive for consumers to share a true piece of news with their neighbors. It's a very reduced form version of that. And you'll see that come up in a second. That's a good question. Okay, so we have a very large number of producers. Producers have a random cost to produce a high quality news story, a CR with a distribution HR. If a producer produces a high quality piece of news, it is true with probability 1. Low quality news is true with probability 0. We could make that some probability lambda and 1 minus lambda, and everything would go through. Producers cannot commit to high quality, and consumers cannot directly observe quality. P0 is, I mentioned this before, is our news veracity. And so you think about it as the average truthfulness of a piece of news which is produced. Okay, here's consumers' demand. Consumers are linked in a directed network G. Each consumer has a certain number of neighbors. These are the number of neighbors D that follow consumer I. That's the way we talk about it. And there's M generating consumers. The reason we fix M consumers is we want to make the network denser without changing the revenue base. We're going to make this symmetric so that D is the same for everyone. Here's this assumption, is that consumers value true news and they're risk neutral. So consumers have a utility benefit if they share a piece of true news, and a utility loss if they share a piece of false news. Okay. They also have a utility benefit if they act on a piece of true news, and a utility loss if they act on a false news. So if you vote for the wrong candidate and you find out later you voted for the wrong candidate, you feel badly. If you tell somebody that something's true and it turns out to be false, you feel badly about it. So that's the consumer's motives for sharing news. It's a reduced form for some sort of social interaction among the consumers. With these benefits and costs, or utility benefits and cost, a consumer will have a threshold belief about the veracity of a piece of news for sharing it and adopting it. Okay, so what you just see here, the news, the way I talk about this is that the news has to be sufficiently likely to be true in order to share it. And the sufficiently likely to be true here is just a probability of 1/2 if we set these benefits and costs to be the same. Okay, all right, so now let's talk about this fact checking. So consumers, we say, can fact check the news. So consumers are going to be receiving a private signal. I read a New York Times article and I say, I know a lot more about, economic research than this reporter. Should I believe this article or not? Do I believe this article or not? And should I share it with my neighbors? So I receive a private signal. If a piece of news is actually true, then this private signal that I get is signal T with probability rho greater than 1/2. If the news is actually false, then the consumers receive a signal F with probability also greater than 1/2. Okay, so rho here is going to be the precision of this private signal. And simply by Bayes' rule, a consumer will then have a posterior belief about the truthfulness of a piece of news, right? Given that they've received the signal T or F. So they have prior P0, they receive a signal, each individual, right? I shouldn't say they, it's not a collective thing. An individual has a prior P0, that prior is going to be a common prior. An individual receives a signal T or signal F, and the individual updates. And we have this posterior belief. And depending on this posterior belief, the consumer will decide whether to share or not, if this posterior belief is greater than 1/2 or less than 1/2. Let me just give you a little visual of that so we can sort of pull the pieces together. So here's our network. And our little arrows are which consumers are following which other consumers. These are the news producers. So the news producers produce a piece of news, and then that gives us this veracity level P0. The producers broadcast that to consumers, and each consumer receives any piece of news with probability B. So let's take a look at this consumer. Suppose this little consumer has received a piece of news, and this consumer is saying, should I decide to tell my friends about this news that I just received or I just read? This consumer gets a private signal T or F. And let's suppose the signal is T, which raises this consumer's a posterior to a sufficient level, greater than 1/2, so that the consumer then passes it on to his friends. Okay, so that's how news spreads within this network. And then we stop. We do not do a further spreading. We just have a 2-period model, as I showed you in the introduction.
Do they all have a common prior?
Yes, it's going to be the prior P0 is a common, I don't assume a common prior, it's just a game, and P0 is a belief in the game. So, but I don't have to assume a common prior. That's not anything special. But yes, every consumer is going to understand in the context of this Nash equilibrium what the strategies are of the producers, and so everyone will have the same prior P0. So let me show you the game. So the information assumptions essentially give us a simultaneous move game, right? So back in my information assumptions, to make this clear, where were they? I kind of went through them quickly. Here they are. Producers cannot commit to high quality, and consumers cannot directly observe quality. So essentially, producers are producing high or low quality. Consumers are then receiving a piece of news, not knowing what that decision was. So essentially, and then deciding whether or not to share that news. So essentially, we have a simultaneous move game, even though it's not literally simultaneous. It's because the consumers do not have the information about what producers have actually done that transforms this into a simultaneous move game. So consumers' best response is to we're going to derive the consumer best response of whether or not to share a given piece of news, given the news veracity P0, and the producer best response is going to be to decide to produce high or low quality, which gives us P0, given consumer sharing. And our solution is just, we're going to be looking for a symmetric stable Nash equilibrium. Okay, so let me break that down. Okay, first of all, let's take a look at consumers' optimal sharing rule. So consumers are going to be deciding whether or not to share given P0, right? P0 is the expected veracity, what we call the veracity of the news, which is the expectation that a piece of news is true or false. And this is the sharing rule. This is ZT is the probability of sharing after seeing a signal T, and ZF is the probability of sharing after seeing a signal F. Okay. As we said, a consumer will share if and only if their posterior belief is greater than a half. So how does this play out? So again, consumers are deciding what to do. They have this prior belief P0, and that P0 is endogenous. It's going to be determined in equilibrium, right? But for any given P0, what is the consumer's best reply? Well, the consumer should never share a piece of news, right? If the consumer, if P0 is less than 1 minus rho, because then at that point, the consumer's posterior belief is going to be less than 1/2. So this is what I'm doing here is a mapping for P0 from 0 to 1, and here P0 is exactly equal to 1 minus rho. At exactly 1 minus rho, when P0 is exactly equal to 1 minus rho, the consumer becomes indifferent between sharing or not, having received a signal T. Okay. And so here this consumer will begin to share after receiving a private signal T, but not after receiving a private signal F. And if P0 is sufficiently high, so that P0 is equal to rho, at that point, the consumer becomes indifferent between sharing after receiving a private signal F, and the consumer would then always share. So if the prior belief, this is all very simple stuff, right? If the prior belief is sufficiently high, so between rho and 1, the consumer shares no matter what their private signal is. If the prior belief is sufficiently low, the consumer never shares no matter what their private signal is. And it's in this middle range where the consumer takes into consideration their private signal T and F and decides whether or not to share a piece of news. So this is the consumer's best reply to a P0. Okay. Now let's think about producers. And my base case is going to be where producers have revenues from producers' revenues are coming from consumers viewing the news. So this is this advertising revenue model. So given the rate at which consumers are sharing the news, because remember what consumers are doing is that they receive a piece of the news, they say, oh, should I share it or not? And they pass it on to their neighbors. And when they pass it on to their neighbors, the advertising goes along with it, right? So that person clicks and sees the same New York Times article. Then the producer will then get revenues. And the click-through rate, the rate at which consumers are then sharing this news, is going to depend on whether the piece of news is true or the piece of news is false, because that's going to give you the rate at which it passes through the consumer's filter, right? That's what gives you the probability of the consumers receiving the signals of true or false. Okay, so that's just a little bit of fixing where we are in the model here. So a producer is going to get some extra revenues, right, from producing true news, because true news is more likely to produce true signals and is more likely to get through to more consumers. So that's the extra revenues from true news. Okay. And a producer is going to produce high quality whenever the costs are such that it makes sense to do so, right? So producing a higher, taking on a higher cost of production is compensated by the additional advertising revenue that you get from, that the producer will get from producing that true piece of news. So that gives us the producer's best reply to the consumer sharing behavior. Okay, now we can put the two of these together. Okay, so what I have down here on the bottom is the consumer's sharing rule, right? And let's see what happens for how, what I'm now doing is mapping producer's best reply. So when consumers, so where's my little cursor? When consumers never share, they don't share after a T or after a F, of course, producers are going to produce nothing. But as consumers begin to share some stories, right? They share after receiving a true signal, but not after receiving a false signal, private signal. Then, of course, revenues increase for producers. The incremental revenue producing a true piece of news is large, and producers will produce at high quality news at a greater rate. And at right this point, we get the maximal news veracity, right? This is the highest possible news veracity we could obtain in an equilibrium, because after this point, when consumers are sharing after they receive a true signal, they're sharing at a higher rate. Now, some false piece of news is getting through too. More and more false news is getting through too, which then the producers say, why should I produce the true news if the false news is getting through too? And so then we see a reduction in the producer's incentives to produce true news. And so we see a fall in this best reply. At this point right here, which is where a consumer is sharing always after getting a signal T, but not after F, that we just mark it because we have a discontinuity here. And you'll see in a second, we just call that the pure filtering news veracity. And as we keep going, so what's going along here, consumers are now sharing not only when they receive a true signal, they're also sharing after they receive a false signal, a signal F. So, okay, so this is really reducing producers' incentives to produce true news. And eventually, of course, if consumers share all of the time, then producers have no incentive at all to produce any true news. So this is a mapping of the producer's best reply. And we just superimpose on this. Gosh, where is it? Okay. Now, sorry, this is the consumer's best reply. And this is just a little bit, if you kind of flip your head around, this is the graph I had a little bit earlier on. When P0 is between 0 and 1 minus rho, consumers don't share. When P0 is between 1 minus rho and rho, that's where the consumer is sharing, is doing this filtering, is what we were calling filtering. And then when P0 hits exactly rho, then consumers are always sharing. And then when we superimpose on that, we have our two best reply functions, which gives us our equilibria. And so the main result is that we have a unique, stable, functional equilibrium. So this equilibrium here is where true news is being produced. The equilibrium veracity is level rho. Consumers are sharing always after T and sometimes after seeing a signal F. There is a dynamically unstable equilibrium. And of course, there is a dysfunctional equilibrium. So that is our equilibrium. Now, so we have a unique, stable, functional equilibrium. Now, of course, the existence of this equilibrium depends on the height of this best reply curve. And that reflects producers' costs. So let me just go through that. So if producers have sufficiently low costs to produce true news, this would be the picture that we have. And we have this equilibrium at a fairly high level of true news. As the costs as it becomes more and more expensive to produce true news, of course, this best reply curve for producers keeps shifting down and down. And of course, if it's very expensive to produce high quality news, we're not going to have any high quality news production. So what I'd like to do as we move on is just focus on this particular case, because obviously this case where producers' costs are so high that no true news is being produced isn't particularly interesting. So we're going to focus on this particular case where true news is being produced at a pretty fast clip. And I'm going to introduce now our misinformation agents. So to consider a mass M of misinformation agents who are alongside the mass M of bona fide producers. So the total quantity of news which is produced is 1 plus M. And high quality news is just P0Z as before, because I don't have it on this slide, but it should be there that the mass M of misinformation agents always produces low quality of news. Okay, so the share of total news that is true is, we're just going to label that P0 of M. So it's the fraction, essentially the fraction of all news that is produced by the real news producers out there, the high quality news that they produce. So for a fixed level of high quality news, we know that if you were to introduce more misinformation, it could decrease total news veracity. But again, the key to this paper is that the news production isn't fixed. High quality news production is not necessarily fixed. And so we have a result which tells us that if there's a high enough number of these misinformation agents, yes, indeed, the market is dysfunctional. We will have no high quality news production, the media market falls apart. However, if we're in the world where producers were already producing high quality news and we introduce some information, misinformation, not a gigantic amount, but some, we can actually increase the quality of news production. And what's going on here, remember, it's an equilibrium. So consumers, right, they're facing this news market. They know that there's these misinformation agents out there. So they know the proportion of the news which they're seeing, a larger proportion of the news that they're seeing is possibly false. So they're going to, so their P0, P0 twiddle, right, has changed. And they're not necessarily, so their posterior has also changed. So they're not passing on news as quickly, right? And if we're in the world where false news was getting through quickly, it's now not getting through as quickly, right? And so that changes the incentives for the bona fide news producers. They know it's actually harder to get news through, and so they will increase the quality of their production. So in a picture, this is what this looks like. This is the base, our initial setting where M is 0. We have no misinformation agents. This is the producer's best reply function. This is just that equilibrium I showed you before. Okay, so we've got high quality news production, and the consumers are sharing always if they see a true signal, sometimes if they see a false signal. And again, a signal which is false. Sorry, a signal F, I guess. The signal, okay, the signal is the signal F. Now let's introduce some misinformation agents. Essentially, this is the proportion of the news which is true, right? Consumers know this, right? Consumers understand this, and they are going to reduce the rate at which they pass on a piece of news after receiving a signal equal to F, because of course their prior that a piece of news that they received as true is lower. So we're going to have a new equilibrium. This is the equilibrium news veracity. But what's going on in this equilibrium is that producers are producing more high quality news stories and consumers are sharing less often. So introducing some misinformation doesn't destroy the market, unless it's a huge amount of misinformation. What it can actually do is decrease in consumers' incentives to share and thereby actually increase producers' incentives to produce high quality news because they've got to get through that consumer filter. Okay, of course, if there was more and more misinformation, then yes, we do have a completely dysfunctional news market. But that would be an overwhelming amount of information, misinformation. Okay, so let me give you some comparative statics now on the network density D. So I said this in the introduction when I was doing the overview of the results. Let's take a look at what happens when we increase the number of consumers, the number of neighbors any consumer has. So if we start out in a very low density network, suppose any individual only has, say, 1 or 2 neighbors. That means, so I only have 1 or 2 neighbors. So when I share a piece of news, it only goes to 2 people. Now let's increase the number of neighbors I have from 2 to 3. Excuse me. And our result is that the Equilibrium veracity will increase. And essentially what's happening is the returns, the number of views that a true piece of news gets increases faster than the number of views, that the increase in the number of views a false piece of news gets. So true news is shared marginally more often than false news. But when you're already in a very, very highly dense network, an increase in D will actually decrease news veracity because it's the reverse. The marginal rate, the marginal view, increase in views for a false piece of news is greater than for a true piece of news. So the way to understand this is that in a very dense network, true piece of news is seen almost all the time. And so when you add another link, it's not really changing the rate at which true news is being seen, but it is changing more the rate at which false news is being seen. Or another way to say it, if D is very, very high, then any piece of news eventually gets through. Just got to get through one person. You get through me and then you reach the world, right? So there's less incentive to produce high quality news. So this is in some sense a caution for these very, very dense social networks. It shows you the very perverse incentives that there can be when social networks are incredibly well linked. You can basically get anything through. And so then it gives great incentives for people to produce junk, and which we actually do see, right? And so that's sort of that's the Denver Guardians of the world that are producing false news. Okay, so let me just give you an aside about this last result relative to the literature on media. So historically, there's this wonderful paper that showed that advertising revenues decreased news outlets' dependence on sponsors and reduced bias. So this is, think of the newspaper world. This is newspapers, literally newspapers. And newspapers were sponsored by political parties or unions. And their source of revenue was their sponsor, okay? If the newspapers could now sell advertising to a grocery store or to Macy's or to a department, to advertisers, and their revenues were based on advertising, not on their sponsor, then there would be the newspapers then reduced the bias in their news. So that's a wonderful paper, which I highly recommend. Now let's think about what the message is about advertising revenue in today's connected world. Revenue based on advertising can lead to lower quality news overall, or false news. So we don't have bias in our model, we just have high and low quality news. But it's very clear that if all a newspaper or media outlet cares about is views, eyeballs on a piece of news, and if we're an extremely well-connected world, it's right, then anyone can enter and get some of those eyeballs, which can lead to lower quality. So that's a kind of a counter message to this benefit of advertising revenue. What about revenue, though, that's based on consumers' actions? So this is now news outlets that care about what consumers actually do when they see a piece of news, not just about eyeballs on a piece of news, but an action taken based on that news. So that's our next model. I'm not going to go through it in depth. But just give you a sense of how that model works. We have revenues from actions. So it's the same beginning. A consumer sees a piece of news, decides whether or not to share it, having received a private signal, T or F. And what does I share a piece of news, what do my neighbors think? Okay, so my neighbor, I have neighbors, and my neighbors are not only seeing my sharing behavior, they're seeing all of their neighbors' sharing behavior. So an individual takes a look out there and says, okay, what proportion of my neighbors, what proportions of the people I follow, right? So I follow a bunch of people in this social network. What proportion of those people have shared with me a piece of that news? So I take a look at that proportion, and I take a look at my own private signal, and I have a posterior belief as to whether or not a piece of news is true or false. And then I act on it, and I get benefits, personal benefits from acting on a piece of true news. Well, in a market, we call it a limit market, as the number of links gets sufficiently large. So in the limit, consumers can actually perfectly discern whether a story is true or false by looking at the proportion of the number of people that the proportion of their neighbors, the people that they follow who share or not. So it's just a law of large numbers story. So true stories then will earn revenues M, because that's the revenue base, and false stories will earn nothing. And our unique functional equilibrium has news veracity simply equal to the revenues of the marginal consumer. So we get a completely opposite conclusion when producers' revenues are based on actions rather than ads. So again, if producers only care about ad revenue, right, we will have a low quality equilibrium. That's the only, in a very, very, very densely connected network. And the opposite conclusion, if all producers care about is the action that consumers take. So this ad revenues is actually decreasing, again, these ad revenues is decreasing the veracity, overall veracity of the news. Okay, so let me summarize and take questions. So we've got a simple, hopefully simple, market for news where consumers are rational, they value sharing and adopting true news. Producers are profit maximizing where they bear a higher cost for true news. Equilibria exists with high quality news, but false news circulates in any equilibrium. Higher network density can increase the production of false news. Misinformation can actually increase the production of high quality news, because again, remember we're in an equilibrium here, that you inject some misinformation into a news market, the players here being the consumers and the producers are adjusting, right? Consumers share less, that gives producers the incentive actually to up their game and produce higher quality news. Revenues from consumers' actions can indeed improve news quality. So some places where one could go with this kind of model or this kind of framework, obviously endogenous network links. So our links here have clear information externalities. So our links are completely exogenous. We're not asking where they come from. Links have these information externalities. So what is the role of social media? Actually, we didn't talk at all about the platforms, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, that actually create these links or subsidize these link costs between consumers. Another direction to go would be to look at the industrial organization of the producers. So our producers here are just these independent producers. They're tiny, little, small. What if the news outlets were able to establish reputations? I actually think that's not as interesting as we thought it would be. I can tell you about why not. But subscription business models are a bit more interesting. Competition among news outlets, and especially curation of news. Could there be, again, Facebook is doing a bit more of this curation of news, and how does that impact sharing? So if you know that your platform is curating the news, how does that change the sharing behavior of consumers? And another aspect which could be really interesting to understand is if the news product itself had several dimensions. So right now, all that a consumer cares about is sharing news that is true. We know that consumers share news for other reasons. They share surprising news, humorous news, shocking news. And indeed, producers can add those elements to the product that they're actually selling. So could we think about the interaction or complementarity of these other elements of news to the news spread, and how that affects actually the news quality? And I have to say, this is the most speculative part. I'm not sure I have any particularly good insights, even in my thought process, about these things. I think it's really, really intriguing to think about, actually going back to an initial question, why are people actually sharing news? And we know that there's a variety of reasons that, and they may interact. So thanks very much. I think we do have some time for some questions.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I had a few questions, but I'm going to wait to see if others want to ask first. Otherwise, I'll go ahead. Any questions before I start? Okay, let me start.
Question. I do have a question.
Let me start first, and I'll go ahead.
And so it's very much, I've been thinking about this during the talk. It's very much related to these other characteristics of news that you were talking about, and about what are the incentives of people to share news. Like something that I have in mind is that, you know, perhaps like people share with an agenda too. I mean, they want to, you know, they want to convince, you know, some other people of a, you know, certain beliefs, and they don't care about whether news are true or not, and they share that they share news with other considerations rather that are not just whether the piece of news is true or not. And also what came to mind is that, you know, if you are in the you know, industry of producing fake news, like I will guess that if someone who is like producing fake news is more unrestricted than someone who is producing true news. And you know, it is easier to add elements of surprise, humor, or shock, right? And you know, and I wanted to ask you about this. Thank you.
So that's great. So I'll just start backwards. Yes, I think that's exactly what we were thinking about, my last bullet point. I think that would be really, really interesting to understand the complementarity between something like surprise or humor and the news truth. But of course, consumers should understand that too, right? They should know that it might be harder to make a piece of true news funny. And so they could also be making inferences based on how funny a piece of news is. So it's this interesting complementarity, but then of course consumers are going to be rational. And again, it depends on what their objectives are. Maybe they actually just want to share something that's funny, right? And maybe they don't care about the truth. But if they actually think that people might believe it and will affect voting, well, then they might be more cautious. So it gets back to this, you know, questions about why are consumers actually sharing, not only the characteristics of the news, but why they're sharing. And in your first point about people sharing the news with an agenda, so I have some other work where I was exploring exactly that. It's one of the papers that's listed in the literature review, since it's not surprising, of course, that I'm now doing this piece. And the consumers were either biased or unbiased. And so there would be some consumers that would just want the truth to come, you know, to be passed along. And then there were other consumers who they would benefit from, say, blocking a true piece of news because it was against their interests, right? So a true piece of news that you should vote for such and such a candidate, that of course is against my own political agenda, or my, you know, would be hurting my own economic outcomes. And there we get some pretty interesting results. There the focus was a bit more on how should these, depending on how these biased consumers were distributed through a network, would news travel or not? And so here, so this particular model that I presented today, we just have the news going one, you know, it just gets through and then we stop and we say, okay, now we'll just take a snapshot there. You could think about news traveling, you know, through a network, and some people trying to block something that they don't want to get through because it will then influence people's behavior. And for that, I can refer you to this other piece. And there, of course, there you get into all sorts of interesting questions about basically little components of the network where there's more or less biased agents within different components.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So I had a question, actually two. One was sort of closer to Alberto's question. Right now in your model, whether or not I share has nothing to do with me trying to affirm what I already believed, meaning what my prior was, or how surprising the news is. Presumably, if surprise becomes a motive, then that introduces some strategic substitute-like thing where, you know, if I see that other people may be sharing the news, then I perhaps wouldn't want to share because then it wouldn't be surprising. And then also the heterogeneity of the priors, wouldn't that sort of change how I behave?
Yeah.
I guess if truth is all I care about, then maybe it doesn't. But if affirmation is also a motive, then
right. Our consumers are really bland. I have to say, our consumers are very bland. They only care about one thing, and they're homogeneous. And right, and so and surprise is kind of an interesting thing to think about in a Bayesian world. So do I put some bonus on something that I wasn't expecting? And of course, if you just use Bayes' rule, you shouldn't be doing that, right? So I agree with all of what you said. I can tell you where we're going that I think gets a little bit, makes our consumers less bland. So again, we're thinking about this as these are the problems that arise in a world where consumers are completely rational and we get a lot of falsehoods, right? Just from the network element. So we don't even need these fancy things to get the fact that social networks lead to potentially a lot of low quality false news. So in some sense, that's part of the message. We don't have to go to humor or shock. It's just Bayesian consumers. And if all the if producers care about eyeballs, this is the world we're in. So part of it is that message. One of the things that we're going to do is introduce a bit of heterogeneity among our consumers, just a little bit, which I think sort of smooths out the model a little bit, where consumers will have different capacities it's basically their private signals could be more or less precise. And so we have a little bit of heterogeneity there among the consumers, which just makes them slightly less bland. But again, you know, the selling point of the model is that we don't really need anything fancy to get a lot of fake news. It's part of the result, which leads me to the middle bullet points here about the industrial organization of producers, right? Is that's where we may need to be looking for to get us out of this conundrum that we might be in right now.
I see. And so my other question was more about heterogeneity in terms of the network. Do you envision having some heterogeneity in influences, like people having different in and out degrees, or how that may affect the outcomes?
Well, right now, in terms of, it won't really affect, as long as we make, it doesn't really make a big difference. That's why we went to homogeneity. There wasn't anything particularly interesting of having more or less connected people because everybody was the same in all these other dimensions. And all of that is that maybe producers might be wanting to target those people who had more connections. But we thought, okay, well, we already know that. I mean, you know, that's not, you know, we know that producers might want to do that. So we don't think we were going to go in that direction. I think the direction we might go in is this heterogeneity in expertise, so to speak. And then it might be that it becomes more interesting if the people who have particularly precise signals are linked to more people, then that becomes interesting. So we haven't gone there yet, but that might be a direction to go. So, you know, as we're modeling, we make choices about what to cut out that is not going to potentially add to to what we think is the interesting conclusions. It's not going to be a driving force of our conclusions. So let's make it as simple as possible in that dimension.
Thank you. So I just wanted to mention that we have two papers that are, I believe, related to some of the things you talked about. So I'll share it with you offline.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah. So please, anyone, email me. We want to know about, especially in our world where we're all isolated, Please email me if you've got related literature, things that you'd like to tell me about. We would absolutely love to have that feedback and those sources.
Wonderful. Any other questions before we conclude? If not, let's thank Rachel again. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was wonderful to have you.